I'm Jim Stanford, economist and director of the Center for Future Work in Vancouver. I think we've all experienced that Canadians are pretty worried right now and pretty angry right now about how much stuff costs. Since the pandemic, it's been harder and harder for most families to make ends meet, especially where buying the necessities of life are concerned: housing, energy, food. And of course, there are a lot of different storylines out there, stories about why things have become more expensive and what should be done about it. In this context, I think it's important that we get full information about what's been happening, who's to blame, who's not to blame, because it's easy at a moment of popular worry and anger to fall into different scapegoats for our challenges and blame them because they seem like a convenient culprit. Some groups are saying that we should blame immigrants for high costs. We should blame governments. We should blame taxes. We should blame unions because they're greedy and demanding too high wages. So let's take a look at these arguments and compare them to the actual economic evidence and come up with a better understanding of the challenges to living standards in Canada. Those challenges are real, but also a more effective vision for how to fight to defend workers' living standards. Rather than scapegoating people who are not to blame, immigrants and governments and unions.
I'll be referring to research on wages, prices, and profits that we've published on our website, centerforfuturework.ca. Check that out, or follow us on all the social media platforms. It is the rise of inflation after the COVID pandemic that really focused Canadians' concerns and anger about the cost of buying essentials. Inflation typically runs at about 2% a year. At first, during the pandemic, it fell to around zero during the lockdowns because people couldn't go out shopping, and so prices fell. But as soon as the economy reopened, suddenly inflation reared its head in a big way, and it soared to a peak of 8% by mid-2022. Then it came down as fast as it went up. And in the subsequent 2 years, inflation fell back from its 8% rate until we reached the normal 2% rate, which is the target of the Bank of Canada. The Bank of Canada tries to keep inflation in Canada at around 2%, and we're back there now. So this was a mountain we climbed and a mountain we've come back down. And in that intervening period, the cost of necessities in Canada seemed unbearably high, and Canadians wondered how they would make ends meet. Now, the inflation is back to its normal 2% rate. Prices are still high, of course, because they rose in the meantime. Wages and incomes also rose in the meantime. But to some degree, the official inflation rate shown here, the Consumer Price Index, doesn't capture the full story of things like higher housing costs, for example, which are imperfectly included within the Consumer Price Index. And also, the official inflation rate doesn't talk about distribution, the fact that low-income and working Canadians spend more money on necessities, which turned out to be even more inflationary during this period. The overall inflation rate is now back to the 2% target. Now, the Bank of Canada has a storyline, a narrative about what caused that surge in inflation and how they managed to get it back down. In their view, inflation results from too much spending power. The reason prices are too high is because Canadians have too much money in their wallets to spend. Sounds far-fetched, doesn't it? The term they use for this is excess demand. And in general, in conventional anti-inflation theory, the main source of excess demand is wage income, for the obvious reason that most people have to work for a living, and wages and salaries are the biggest source of personal income. So in the Bank of Canada's view, if there's too much spending power, we've got to put a lid on wages, stop wages from growing so quickly, and that will reduce the excess demand, and that will reduce inflation. The way to do that, in their storyline, is to jack up interest rates, which they did, starting in early 2022. And they kept interest rates very high for over 2 years, and now interest rates are coming back down. How do higher interest rates work? First of all, it slows down the economy, slows down job creation, leads to higher unemployment. And when unemployment is higher, workers can't demand as much wage income because the employers know there's lots of unemployed people out there, so they can bargain down the wage demands. Secondly, high interest rates means that any household with debt, like a mortgage or credit cards or a car loan, is going to now have to divert more of their income away from buying goods and services, the necessities of life, and instead pay it to the bank in higher interest rates. So that also reduces spending power. Both ways, spending power will be cut, and inflation, in theory, should come back down. The governor of the Bank of Canada, Tiff Macklem, said the quiet bits out loud as this whole thing was starting in 2022. He said, the problem with inflation is unemployment is too low. It's only 5% at that time. It sounds crazy for a leading economic official to say that unemployment is too low and we want to get it back up. But that's exactly what he wanted to do, and that's exactly what he did. So unemployment has climbed. It's now about 6.5%. And that doesn't tell the whole story, because there's lots of unemployed Canadians and underemployed Canadians struggling to find work and enough work to support themselves and their families. Well, let's look at this theory of the Bank of Canada, this old wage price spiral model, that inflation is caused by workers demanding too much money. That causes higher prices, and then the workers demand even more money. Here is the takeoff of inflation after the pandemic. Now measured on the right-hand side, it went from 2% to 8%. Here is the increase over the same period in what's called unit labor costs. This is the total cost of wages and salaries and health benefits and pensions, all compensation in nominal terms relative to the real output of the economy. And this was growing along at a steady, normal rate. Unit labor costs should go up year after year, in part because inflation is, we want a little bit of inflation in our economy, and in part because workers become more productive over time and therefore deserve higher wages. So unit labor costs were growing along at a normal pace, no connection to the rise of inflation, no connection to the fall of inflation either. We climbed down the mountain as fast as we climbed up it, and unit labor costs just kept trucking along at a slow, steady pace. So the story that the inflationary episode was caused by workers and their wage demands, no evidence for it whatsoever. This argument is inherited from the 1970s when central bankers like Mr. Macklem fought hard against the so-called wage price spiral, but that was not the story in this post-pandemic inflation. Even more generally, the claim that too much purchasing power among Canadians caused the inflation wasn't true. Even in addition to wages and salaries, workers can get purchasing power from other means. For example, during the pandemic, the government provided CERB and other emergency benefits to households. Very powerful, very quick, and very effective. Stopped us from having a depression. So purchasing power did go up in Canada in the first period of the pandemic during the actual lockdowns, because those benefits, it turned out, were enough to offset and then some the lost wage income from the shutdowns. And this was a good thing. It meant that Canadians didn't lose their houses and we didn't end up in an all-out depression. But those benefits were very short-lived and were clawed back long before inflation started taking off again. And since then, household disposable income has stagnated at first and then now is growing, but growing slowly. No connection between purchasing power and the rise and fall of inflation. Mr. Macklem is blaming the victims of inflation when he says that it was caused because we spend too much money. Not so. There's another narrative out there, even more dangerous, coming from the right-wing populists, the convoy crowd, the haters, led by Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party. They have an even more misguided theory about inflation. They say it was caused by Justin Trudeau. They even gave it its own name, just inflation, they called it. And apparently, since this was a worldwide phenomenon, Canada's inflation was no different than other countries. In fact, it was a little bit less rapid than most other countries, including the U.S. But apparently, Justin Trudeau caused inflation everywhere, not just in Canada. It's ridiculous. But the storyline of Mr. Poilievre is there was too much government handouts during the pandemic. It's a version of that same excess demand theory that we've just rebutted. Too much government debt because the government had deficits in this time to pay for the CERB benefits and other emergency measures, and too high taxes, especially the carbon tax, which apparently has been the source of all evil. Again, contradictions even within his own storyline. How can you blame government deficits but also blame government taxes? Because the higher the taxes are, the smaller the deficit is. So you kind of can't have it both ways. But at any rate, this has all fed into his narrative that Canada is broken, and the inflation that we experienced and the challenges to living standards that average workers are experiencing is a sign that the government has just royally screwed up everything, and have an election, vote for Mr. Poilievre, and everything will be better. What he plans to do about it: cut government spending, axe the tax has been his big slogan about the carbon tax, but also bring in other tax cuts that would undermine public services like education and healthcare across Canada. Well, let's look at some of the facts around this. This shows the size of the federal deficit as a share of GDP, the blue line. And indeed, there was a big spike in the deficit during the lockdowns, during the pandemic, that was the result of the CERB benefits and all the other emergency measures that helped us avoid a depression. But again, those spending measures and the size of the deficit were rolled back very quickly. And by the time inflation took off in the latter half of 2021 and then peaked in 2022, the federal deficit had mostly disappeared and has stayed small as a share of GDP ever since. Interesting to contrast Canada's experience here with the United States. The United States has had a much bigger deficit, 6 or 7 times bigger as a share of GDP than Canada, yet their inflation has been about the same as ours, and their economy has been quite a bit stronger. So the idea that the deficit is the source of the problem, not credible. What about taxes in general? In general, government taxes relative to the size of the economy fell during the first period of the the first period of the pandemic, because the economy was shut down. So people weren't working, they weren't paying income tax, and they weren't shopping, so they weren't paying GST. So government revenues fell, but that was when inflation also fell. When the economy reopened, then government revenues returned to normal and started to grow again at a normal, gradual pace. So inflation rose and inflation fell. Government revenue has just been normal during this period. Hard to blame taxes in general. Mr. Poilievre, of course, likes to blame the carbon tax in particular for everything that's wrong. And in this case, the storyline is exactly the opposite of what he's saying. The carbon price in Canada was brought in 2019. And for the first 2 years of the carbon price, inflation was low. In fact, during the early stage of the pandemic, it fell to zero. Then, when inflation took off in peak in the middle of 2022, the carbon price fell as a share of the overall cost of energy. So relative to the price of gasoline, for example, which soared during 2022, the carbon tax was just increasing by a little bit each year. And as a share of what you paid at the gas pump, it fell dramatically. So you cannot blame the carbon price for the takeoff of gasoline prices. The exact opposite happened. In general, if the carbon tax continues, and its future is obviously uncertain given the politics, but it would add a couple of cents per liter of gasoline year after year after year. And as a share of overall gasoline prices, it will fall. And there's no argument that you can say that it caused the inflation. This is why the Conservatives and the corporations that support the Conservatives, particularly the oil and gas industry, really want to focus on the carbon tax. The carbon price system in Canada at peak inflation year 2022 added about 2 cents to the cost of a liter of gasoline. So who else added to the cost of a liter of gasoline? The oil and gas sector itself, through the higher prices they were charging, added 35 cents to the price of your gasoline. So about 15 or more times as much as the carbon price. They want us to focus on the little bar and ignore the big bar. And there's a lesson for us in terms of who the true culprits are here. Neither Mr. Macklem nor Mr. Poilievre will acknowledge the elephant in the room in terms of the history of post-pandemic inflation in Canada, what caused it, and what we should do about it. Prices don't just rise as an automatic result of market forces. Prices rise because a company that sells something deliberately increases the price of it. And there's nothing natural or inevitable about it, and it cannot be ascribed to just supply and demand. Even if you're in an emergency situation because of disruptions during the pandemic, there's no automatic inevitability that the prices of things must become more expensive just because there's shorter supply. It's a response of companies who are trying to maximize their own profits, and they'll take advantage of a moment of uncertainty and disruption to increase their prices. And that's exactly what companies did in Canada. As we experienced peak inflation in 2022, corporations in Canada experienced peak profits. Profits as a share of GDP rose to their highest level ever in 2022. And the stock market rose to record highs in 2022. So while Canadians were dealing with a health emergency and an economic emergency and a crisis in living standards, corporations literally never had it better. And those two things are linked. So let's look again at the relationship between wages, prices, and profits. Here's inflation on the way up after the pandemic and the reopening of the economy. Here's that slow, steady growth in unit labor costs. No story to tell here. Well, let's look at something called unit profit costs. Statistics Canada doesn't even publish this, but you can calculate it from the data, and I've done that. Here is the cost for each unit of output of corporate profits in Canada. And lo and behold, it matches the takeoff of inflation perfectly on the way up. It was clearly companies taking advantage of the moment, all the disruptions of the pandemic, to increase their profits to their highest share ever. Now what's happened on the way down? Inflation has come back down to 2%. Labor costs just trucking along at a normal, slow, steady pace. And lo and behold, unit profit costs have also declined. Because of the normalization of supply chains and reductions in world energy costs and normalization of consumer demand patterns. Their ability to extract those special profits at a moment of crisis has eroded. Profits are still high, but on the way up and on the way down, the link between inflation and corporate profits is crystal clear. And the Bank of Canada and Mr. Poilievre want to talk about it. What happened? How did companies have the power to increase prices so dramatically at the moment of crisis? Well, you had all kinds of disruptions happening in Canada's economy and globally. You had supply chains that couldn't function because of restrictions on transportation or closures, even in far-off manufacturing centers in Asia or elsewhere. You had shortages of key commodities as a result, everything from semiconductors to new cars to building materials in very short supply. You had sudden shifts in consumer demand. At first, you couldn't shop at all with the lockdowns. Then you did a lot of shopping online instead of in retail stores. And Canadians, like other countries, shifted their demand to buying goods rather than services because you still couldn't eat out in restaurants or travel like normally. So there was a surge in demand for goods and weakness in demand for services. On top of it all, you then had the outbreak of war with the invasion of Ukraine and a takeoff in world oil prices. Not because of a true shortage in oil. Oil supply wasn't really affected, but more because of fear and speculation and gambling, basically, on world oil markets that drove up energy prices. And here in Canada, rightly or wrongly, we have tied our prices to those world oil prices. So all of those things came together. Companies in many areas of the economy, not everywhere, anywhere they had a pinch point, anywhere they had strategic leverage, could take advantage of that moment and drive up their prices and their profits. And lo and behold, the pain was worst in the key essentials, things that we have to buy no matter what the price is, like housing, energy, and food. Now, profits have moderated since the peak of inflation in 2022, but they're still relatively high. So this shows the overall flow of gross operating profits for Canada's corporate sector increased by over 50% between 2019 and 2022. Now, they've moderated a bit since then, but they're still unusually high relative to the historical trend. So even though unit profit costs have fallen, don't shed a tear for corporate Canada. They're still doing very well. Now, this is research that we've done at our center, where we gathered data on the most profitable industries in Canada, those who really made money during the crisis after the pandemic. We've identified 20 super profitable sectors who increased their profit between 2019, the last year before the pandemic, and 2022, peak year of inflation and the peak crisis in Canada's living standards. And I've included all 20 industries that either increased their profits by more than $5 billion in that period, or increased their profits by more than 100%. Okay, so that was my benchmark. If you doubled your profits, you're on this list, or if you increased your profits by more than $5 billion, you're on this list. And this shows you the 20 sectors that really cleaned up. Now, there's about 60 different sectors in Canada, so not every company was able to do this. But those that had a pinch point, those that had strategic leverage at the moment of crisis, were able to use their power to increase prices, and they did. So let's look at who's on this list. It's an incredible rogues gallery of the things that we paid too much for during the aftermath of the pandemic. First of all, let's look at the oil and gas sector, because they're at the top of the list. $44 billion increase in those over that 3-year period for the oil and gas sector. That's almost 1,000%, 1,000% increase in oil and gas profits. And that doesn't count the downstream industry, the refining and distribution of gasoline and heating oil and other products. Another $7.5 billion, or 63% increase in their profits. So put that together, that's over $50 billion in excess profits to the energy sector because of those high prices that we paid, because of how they have the power to set the price in Canada, and we follow along these global market trends, rightly or wrongly. No wonder they want us to talk about the carbon tax, because they don't want us to talk about this. What about housing? Let's look at the housing sector here. All kinds of contributors here. Obviously, first and foremost, the real estate sector and the housing development sector. Their profits increased about 70% over that period for a combined $37 billion. But some of the inputs to the housing construction sector, including the forestry industry, wood and paper product manufacturing, building products, wholesale. Those are industries where there was a pinch point during the post-pandemic period. Building supplies were in short supply because so many people wanted to renovate their basement instead of going on a trip, because you couldn't go on a trip. So for a while, these industries, again, took advantage of our desperation and increased their profits. So the sellers of housing, the developers of housing, and then the suppliers of inputs to construction all made out like bandits during this period. You want to know why housing prices increased so much? Not because of Justin Trudeau, okay? Not because of the deficit, but because of the greed at every sector, every step of the way in the private commodified housing industry. Behind that, linked closely to the housing sector, of course, is the banking industry, because you have to get a mortgage to go and buy a house. And they profited dramatically during this period as well, including the core big banks, but also some of the specialty activities that the private banks and private investors and investment banks and brokerages undertake as well. So in the financial sector of the economy, profits have never been bigger, including on insurance. Anyone who's buying home insurance these days knows full well that the insurance industry has jacked up their prices. Finally, let's talk about food as another essential. Interesting, there's been a lot of public anger about the supermarkets, and rightly so. You know, Galen Weston and the other big chains, the Metro chain, the Loblaws chain, the Sobeys chain, have earned higher profits than they ever have. Again, taking advantage of supply chain disruptions and the fact that we have to put food on the table no matter how much it costs. However, the total value of profits in the supermarket industry is kind of small compared to some of the other culprits. And I don't say this to let the supermarkets off the hook. Their profits more than doubled. So absolutely, when we go to buy food and we're paying too much, that is partly because Galen Weston and the others who own these chains are making out like bandits. Same goes for some of the input streams, not the small family farms, but certainly corporate farms and the corporate food processing sector. You know, some of the giant meat processing plants and food manufacturing plants and so on have also increased their profits. Now, it's kind of a mystery. Why did the supermarkets get so much public attention when they were not the worst of the culprits? They were certainly one of the culprits. The energy sector was the biggest culprit. The housing development industry was the second biggest culprit. Food and beverage retailing definitely on the list, and they deserve this attention. They claim that they are only passing on higher costs, but I'll show you in a moment that's not true. So the anger and fear that Canadians have experienced because of this inflation, most acute in those essentials of life that we need to buy. And that fear and anger continues. Grocery prices are still very high. Energy prices have come back down. Housing prices to buy a home, obviously in Canada, still very expensive. So for all of these reasons, there's still a lot of anger out there, even though the overall inflation rate has kind of returned to normal. And that is because people have to buy these things no matter what. And these are the necessity sectors, the energy sector, the housing and development and banking sector that supports it, and the food industry that made out like bandits during the post-pandemic inflation. Just one more note on the supermarkets. Even though the total growth in their profits seems small, $2.5 billion, relative to what the energy industry made, for example. They have still, never mind what the executives say, they have still absolutely capitalized. And what's interesting is, well, profits in some other of those sectors, including the energy sector, have come down a bit since 2022. In the food industry, in the supermarkets, they're still growing. In fact, the last year was the best year ever. This measures supermarket profits, food and beverage retail profits as a share of their revenue. This is their so-called profit margin. And the CEOs claim all they're doing is passing on higher costs for their own inputs to consumers. Don't blame us. In fact, that's not true. The profit margin in supermarkets has more than doubled since the pandemic, and total profits have continued to grow, more than doubling. So those companies absolutely deserve the public criticism they have received. But we should direct some public criticism at the other sectors that have also profited from the desperation of Canadians. Let's talk about how Canadians have been fighting back against this. Because the cost of essentials and other things we buy was growing, Canadian workers quite naturally and predictably said, wait a minute, I got to make more money because prices are higher. And that's exactly what workers have been doing, individually and collectively. They've been demanding higher wages to reflect the rise in the cost of living. And we have seen in the last couple of years a historic increase in labor action, organizing unions, negotiating new contracts, and going on strike when needed. And that rise in union activity has been supported by some of the things that governments have done, because unions have a lot of popular support right now, and politicians know it. Even some conservative politicians know it. So we've seen most provinces increase minimum wages for low-paid workers faster than inflation. So in real terms, minimum wages have gone up quite a bit in most provinces. And we've seen some changes like the anti-scab law federally, or the single-step certification for new unions in British Columbia, some changes that help unions do their job. It's very important here for the culprits, the scapegoats, that Mr. Macklem at the Bank of Canada and Mr. Poilievre, the Conservative, want to blame workers and their wages and unions. Mr. Poilievre pretends that he's speaking out for workers, and he always likes to do a photo op with workers in various settings. But keep in mind, the Conservative Party wants to roll back those changes that have empowered unions to do their job, likely including the anti-scab law federally. And he's also indicated that he's prepared to use the notwithstanding clause to overrule the Charter of Rights, where it affects unions and other basic rights of free association. So beware on this score. He's taking advantage of workers' anger about the cost of living, but he will not empower workers. He will go after workers and their unions if he wins. This shows the historic takeoff in industrial action in Canada. These are total days lost in work stoppages, including strikes and lockouts. Most of them are strikes that really quintupled since the pandemic. And we've seen Canadians and their unions willing to use their power to negotiate higher wages, and it's been working. This shows the increase in average hourly wages in Canada on a year-over-year basis compared to the increase in prices, the inflation rate. So the blue line is that mountain again of inflation that took off after the pandemic and now has come back down to around the 2% level. Wages took some time to catch up once workers figured out what was happening, though, and they got to the bargaining table and they started pressing for more wages. Then we saw wages accelerate to about 5% a year, now slowing a little bit to about 4% a year. That's still twice as fast as inflation. So for the last 2 years, wages have been growing faster than prices, and this is rebuilding the real living standards of Canadians. And it didn't happen naturally. It happened because workers stood up and fought for it. And because we've got unions and labor laws to help us do that, we've been able to succeed better than most other countries in repairing real wages after the pandemic. So in this regard, the claim that Canada is broken is quite wrong. The labor laws and unions and solidarity that we have in Canada has allowed us to rebuild wages. This shows the course of average hourly wages in blue and median hourly wages. The median is the person at the 50% level of the income ladder, the person right in the middle. In some ways, a median is a better measure of how a typical worker is doing than the average is. In both cases, you had a temporary spike in wages during the lockdowns in 2020. That is kind of an artificial result of the fact that so many low-wage workers in Canada lost their jobs when restaurants and retail workers and personal service operations all shut down. So that was temporary. Then we saw the decline in real wages when inflation was roaring ahead and wages were trying to catch up. But now for the last 2 years, we've seen real wages grow again. And in fact, above the trend that was there before the pandemic. So workers should be proud of this, of our ability to fight back and defend our living standards, and we need more of it. So we understand exactly why Canadians are worried about putting food on the table and finding a place to live that they can afford and paying for the energy to get around and stay warm. Now, Mr. Poilievre and the Bank of Canada and the business sector all want us to look the other way and ignore the man behind the green curtain. They all want us to look at scapegoats like immigrants, governments, taxes, and unions. Whereas, in fact, it is corporations who took advantage of the disruption of the pandemic to increase their prices and win the highest profits as a share of GDP ever. So that just tells you something right there. When a national emergency is the best times ever for the corporate sector, we have a good idea of what's going on. That's what caused the crisis in living standards. We now need an agenda to try and enhance living standards. We've been fighting back and we've been winning on the wage front, but we have to keep winning on the wage front. We've got to protect our unions and our minimum wages and our labor laws against the attacks that we'll see from business and from conservative politicians. We have to reject Mr. Macklem's idea that 5% unemployment is too low. We should get unemployment back to 5% and even lower. We should have a situation where anyone who wants to work can, because that's important for our prosperity and it also supports our wages. Our wages are not the only source of our prosperity. Of course, our public services like healthcare and education are all part of our standard of living. And austerity, cutting those things, is not going to help our standard of living. It's going to hurt. Housing in particular, we're going to have to think of different ways to put a roof over people's heads rather than the privatized speculation that we see in the private housing market. We've got to have affordable, regulated, community-based, non-profit or non-market housing that's provided to bring prices down. And at the end of the day, we're going to have to regulate corporations because if they get another chance to jack up prices and they've got a pinch point on the economy, they will. And so we've got to have stronger rules about things like price controls during emergencies, things to regulate and break up very large corporations. In some cases, like energy, even public ownership makes a lot of sense. We can address the challenges in living standards. We can acknowledge Canadians' anger about what's happened, but we have to direct it in a positive way. And we need more investment and more inclusion, not scapegoating. And hopefully this presentation with the facts and figures will help us identify the true culprits and a more hopeful, effective agenda for solving the problem.
Thank you very much for watching. Please check out our website, centerforfuturework.ca, for more information or to sign up for our newsletter.